All right, hello. Welcome to Homework 2C. So this is going to be topics 2.8 through 2.11. Let's talk about the judicial branch. So this is going to be Article 3 of the Constitution, sets up the judicial branch. So Article 1 is the legislative, Article 2 is the executive, Article 3 sets up the judicial. The judicial branch is made up of judges and courts, specifically the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States is shortened to SCOTUS. SCOTUS stands for Supreme Court of the United States. You need to know that abbreviation. And it is made up of 9 justices. Now, this is not the only court system in America, and it's not the only federal court system in America, but we will talk more about that in class. For right now, when we talk about APGov, a lot of what we're going to be talking about when we talk about the federal judiciary is going to be the Supreme Court. So it's set up, like I said, by Article 3 of the Constitution. One document that we are going to go over in class is going to be Federalist 78, and this is yet another document that you'll need to know in addition to Federalist 10 that talks about the division of factions, and Federalist 51, which talks about the separation of powers. Federalist 78 talks about the need for a judiciary. And so Alexander Hamilton and the other writers of the Federalist Papers again, remember, wrote the Federalist Papers to kind of set up their ideas for what a good, strong federal government would look like. And that includes, according to them, a judiciary. They referred to the judiciary as the least dangerous branch for a reason, right? Alexander Hamilton argued that the judiciary is least dangerous because it has, quote, neither force nor will, but merely judgment. And what he meant by that is the judiciary can't actually do anything. Now, that's not true, right? But to simplify it, it's not that they do anything, but they do interpret the law and guide how the other 2 branches do their jobs. So, for example, right, the president can, let's say, deploy the troops. Congress can control the budget and declare war. The court can't do either of those things. So, for example, right, if you remember learning about Andrew Jackson with his whole court case in Georgia with the Native Americans, he was trying to kick Native Americans out of the western United States and out of Georgia specifically, actually, in the east as well. And so he basically said that the Native Americans had to evacuate and leave their homeland, and that would be federal property, basically. John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and said that actually was unconstitutional and the president did not have the power to do that. And Jackson responded, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, which basically means like try me, right? And so the court is actually dependent on the other 2 branches to carry out its rulings, but that doesn't mean that it's not powerful. And so the biggest power that the Supreme Court has is what's called judicial review. Judicial review is the power to look over laws and executive orders and other governmental actions in general to rule whether they are constitutional or not. Now, by constitutional, what we mean is in line with the Constitution. For example, a law that makes Christianity illegal would be unconstitutional because it's not in line with the First Amendment to the Constitution. An executive order that tries to make the president allowed to pass laws would be unconstitutional because it violates Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution that set up the legislature and the executive power. So we're basically giving the judicial branch the right to look at laws and actions of the government and say, is this okay according to the Constitution, or is this what we call unconstitutional, which is not okay, not in line. Okay. Now, another thing to think about here is that the judicial branch, generally speaking, specifically with the Supreme Court, has lifetime tenure for judges. And so the reason for this is to ensure impartiality. They are not supposed to be political. And so we'll talk more about that in just a minute with 2.10. But basically, they are given life tenure, but for a reason. Another thing to remember here with the judicial branch is that their power was really established not necessarily by Article 3, although that too, but by a Supreme Court case in 1803 called Marbury v. Madison. Under Jefferson's tenure, they basically ruled that the Supreme Court does have the power to enact judicial review. And this is a court case that we will talk more about in class, but basically the issue here was, does the judiciary have the power to rule laws and actions constitutional or not? And again, we'll talk more about that in class. It's a really fascinating story and a lot of drama there, but you just need to know that it established judicial review. Okay, and so judicial review, another thing that does when we rule laws constitutional or not and we make judgments in a court of law, we do what's called set precedent. The word precedent means an example, or like something that has happened before that we then base future decisions on, right? For example, when you, let's say your parents go to college and then they encourage you to go to college, right? They can tell you all day long to go to college, but one of the biggest factors in pursuing higher education is whether or not your parents have gone, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't go if your parents didn't go, or it doesn't mean that you have to go if your parents went to college. But it is one of the leading factors in pursuing a higher education is if your parents pursued a higher education. And so it's like kind of like the idea of setting that example for others to follow in the future, right? We also call that stare decisis, and what that means, it means to stand by what has been decided, right? And what that means is a court is not going to go against past rulings unless it's for a specific reason, okay? And so it literally means like let the decision stand, which means if a court has decided something, another court is not going to go against it unless, again, it's for a specific reason. Okay, for example, right, Plessy v. Ferguson. We know in 1896 that court case ruled separate but equal was the law of the land, effectively, right? That it was constitutional to allow for segregation on train cars, bathrooms, schools, whatever, right? And so that separate but equal doctrine was a precedent. Future court cases would look back at that precedent and say, well, you're asking us to desegregate a church, right? Plessy was about train cars, right? Well, that precedent stands here, so we're just going to keep doing that, right? Kind of like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, for nearly 60 years, that precedent held, and future court cases would just go back to Plessy and continue holding that precedent. Then the composition of the court changed and social context evolved, and so the court in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 took the rare step of overturning that precedent. And so overturning a precedent basically means to take the old case that decided one thing and say, we were wrong. We're going to actually change this and decide something else. And they ruled that separate is inherently unequal. So Plessy upheld a precedent, and other cases based their rulings on Plessy's precedent. And then Brown overturned that precedent. So the court values stability through stare decisis, but it's not a straitjacket. It doesn't mean we can never change it. It just means it has to be for a good reason. That's the default setting when we decide something in courts, which means the Supreme Court is really, really important, and what they decide holds not just for that situation, but it can be applied to other cases in the future. And so when we have ideological changes in the Supreme Court, that is also a huge deal, specifically when the president appoints people to the Supreme Court who have the same ideological stance as him, right? So for example, if a Republican president appoints conservative justices, or if a Democratic president appoints liberal justices, that can impact, not just the 4 years of the president's term or 8 years, right? It can affect things for 30 years down the line when that Supreme Court justice he appointed makes a ruling all the way in the future. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court justices have life tenure, and so this is for a reason. It is because justices are supposed to be apolitical. Now, we've already talked about Congress, right? And Congress has either 2-year terms in the House or 6-year terms in the Senate. And that's for a reason, right? They're supposed to be responsive to the people. They're supposed to be easily voted out, and especially the House, right? Every 2 years. And that's why they're given the power of the purse, because if they are being corrupt, they're not spending the money wisely, they're taxing us too much, whatever, we can vote them out relatively quickly. And justices are supposed to be the opposite of that. They're supposed to be removed from the people. And a lot of times people will ask, why? Why would you want them to be removed from the people? Wouldn't you want them to be responsive and respond to changes in what people want? No, because the role of the court is not to do what the people want necessarily. It is the role of the court to rule according to the Constitution. Their role is to interpret the Constitution like it is a sacred text, okay? And then say, this is what the Constitution says, this is what the law says, here is our decision. It is not about people's opinions. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to like social issues or economic issues, depending on your perspective and who they're ruling for, right? So for example, President Eisenhower, right? He was a Republican, very conservative, and he appointed Earl Warren, and he expected him to be conservative, and kind of they knew each other before Warren became a justice. Once on the bench with life tenure, Warren became one of the most liberal chief justices in history. He was well known for being an incredibly liberal justice, and Warren court decisions were well known for judicial activism, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so Eisenhower later told people that was the biggest fool mistake he ever made, right, was appointing Warren, because once he got in there with life tenure, he didn't have to listen to the president. He didn't have to listen to Congress. He didn't have to listen to the people. He could do what he thought was right. Whether you agree or not, whether that was right, that's kind of up to you, but it's that way for a reason. It's so that they can make decisions impartially without having to worry about, will I get reelected? Will my campaign funding come through? They don't have to worry about any of that, and they can make unpopular decisions without worrying about whether or not they'll get, elected or not the next 2 years. They can make unpopular decisions that are what's best for the country and what's best for the Constitution. And so that kind of goes into this was what I just said, right? So independence from current political climate, and then apolitical rulings. And so this shows that life tenure lets the justices ignore the person who hired them and not really have to pander to them and be in their pocket necessarily. They can interpret the law the way they feel is right without the fear of being fired, basically. And that brings us to the two main ways that the justices can be interpreting the laws, right? So let's talk about judicial restraint versus judicial activism. Judicial restraint versus judicial activism are just two different ways to interpret the law, and these are two of many ways, but these are the two that you need to know for your AP exam. Judicial restraint is the idea of reading the law literally the way it is written and the way that it is like in the text, black and white, without really worrying or thinking about what that means practically speaking. Judicial activism is doing what is maybe the justice's opinion, or maybe interpreting the law the way that the justice kind of maybe wants to see it, maybe doing what is right according to their moral compass, or maybe reading it within the context of current events. Neither is good or bad. It is just a different perspective, and different justices can use both throughout their careers. It's not necessarily that one justice will be all about judicial activism or judicial restraint. It's just a different perspective to take. So 2 examples. Let's start with judicial restraint. This is the idea that judges should limit their own power. It's really about what's in the Constitution. We're not making decisions outside the Constitution. It is sticking with the original text. We're not making decisions beyond that. And so a classic decision is going to be the time that in the 20th century, the courts decided that it was not their job to reform child labor. So a court case went to them that basically said we shouldn't have child labor. And they said, actually, not our job. We don't care if children are working in the mines. Now, it's not that they were saying children should be working in the mines. They were saying it's not our job to decide that. Congress needs to reform child labor. And so it's not necessarily that they were pro-child labor. It's that they were saying in the Constitution, it is Congress's job under Article 1 to reform things like this. It is not our job. We can't make this decision for you. versus judicial activism. Judicial activism is usually associated with either the Warren or Burger courts, and so we'll talk more about those in class. But basically, the court can interpret the law the way that they would like to interpret it based on what's best for the country. This can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your perspective. Some people say, no, we should be, practicing judicial restraint, letter of the law only, right? Well, Plessy v. Ferguson was using judicial restraint, right? Segregation. Because according to the Constitution, separate but equal was constitutional according to the courts, right? Brown v. Board of Education was considered judicial activism, which is what desegregated schools, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean one or the other is necessarily bad. It's just a different perspective. And so you just need to know the difference between those two. Judicial activism is also known as legislating from the bench. So that's kind of something to think about. So some checks on the judicial branch. Number one is that the Congress can check the judicial branch, the legislature, by passing legislation to modify prior decisions. And so that can mean they can pass laws that say, hey, we know so the Supreme Court decided this about this specific law. Now we're going to pass a new law, and this is going to change how that decision is played out in real life. They can also pass constitutional amendments. We know to amend the Constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress to propose a piece of legislation to amend the Constitution. And then we need 3/4 of state legislatures to pass it to ratify the amendment. And that has happened. We know that there are 27 amendments. For example, the 26th Amendment, Oregon v. Mitchell, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not force states to lower the voting age to 18 for state elections because elections are a state power. Remember federalism, right? Things like education, licensing, and elections are state powers. And so in this court case, the Supreme Court said Congress cannot lower the voting age to 18. That's not their job. Within months, Congress ends up passing the 26th Amendment, which overrules the Supreme Court by amending the Constitution to create the 18-year-old voting age. Okay, so they basically said, well, if you're not going to let us do it through legislation, we're going to pass an amendment, right? Which is perfectly allowed. It's a checkmate, right? If the court says a law is unconstitutional, change the Constitution. There you go, right? Judicial appointments. This is an executive check. this is where the president can appoint justices to the Supreme Court as well as to lower courts. And he can, appoint people who may have similar ideologies to him. And so that's another way of kind of shaping how the judiciary makes their decisions. And then delayed implementation, right? This is the idea that we can have a court case decide something, but who's going to enforce it is the executive branch. And so the executive branch can kind of make the courts wait for their decision to be implemented. And so, for example, after Brown v. Board of Education, which is what we were talking about earlier, desegregation took decades, like into the 90s. There were still segregated schools. And so the court doesn't have a police force. The Supreme Court is not sending, wasn't sending their justices out in the street to desegregate the schools. They relied on the executive branch to do it. And that took the form of state governors. And in Little Rock, the governor used the National Guard to block students from desegregating schools until Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne. And so the Supreme Court is kind of just words on paper until the executive branch chooses to enforce it, or the states, right? And so until the executive branch kicks in to enforce those laws, rulings on the laws, the Supreme Court has a huge check there in that they can't actually enforce their own rulings. They have to rely on other branches to do that. So that is homework 2C. I will see you next time. Bye.